Hi, this is Andre. I want to talk about using MIDI control for multiple Echoplex Digital Pros. Thank you very much to Steven Clements for commissioning this one. We're going to look at a couple of different types of approaches. One is going to be sending the same exact signal to both EDPs at the same time, basically using them as a giant single stereo EDP. The second thing we're going to look at is using a MIDI splitter box, such as this particular unit. And this is going to allow us to send different commands to different EDPs or combination of EDPs at different points, depending on how we have it configured. Let's also talk briefly about the audio signal flow that's going on here. This is the same Vox ToneLab amp modeler that I've used for all the tutorial videos. We're sending a stereo signal out from it, one to each EDP out of the stereo left and right outputs. Each EDP is set to a 50% wet-dry balance. That means that I'm trying to get as even of a sound between the live input signal and the loop signal as possible. Each EDP is being sent to its own mono input on my computer. So what you're hearing is just two outputs, one from the EDP on top, one from the EDP on bottom. All of the live input signal is coming from the wet-dry control. So it's one output from the ToneLab on each side of the stereo output, to one input on each one of the EDPs, and then each EDP output is going to a mono input on my computer interface. I'm panning each one hard left and right, so you'll be able to hear exactly which one is which. So to start with, we have these two EDPs synced via Brother Sync as one stereo pair. The Behringer foot pedal is sending MIDI commands to the MIDI input on the top EDP. The top EDP is then sending a MIDI out signal to the MIDI input on the white EDP on the bottom. Everything happening on one EDP is happening on the other, both in terms of function and in terms of the audio signal. So they're being used as a slaved stereo pair. Now there's a little bit more reverb from the ToneLab than I would normally use. That's because we're sending a stereo output from the ToneLab, and I want you to be able to hear the stereo imaging with the reverb. So I'm exaggerating that effect a little bit with a slightly wetter signal than I would usually go for. So right now, these are a lot of the typical kind of sussed functions that I like to use. A lot of unrounded multiply, unrounded insert, some sussed replace, that kind of thing. So the biggest limitation you're going to have configuring the EDPs in that sort of way is that you're going to be sending exactly the same command to both of them at the same time. And if you're just using two EDPs as one stereo pair, then that's fine. That's going to be what you want to do. For me personally, the biggest problem I have with that is that sometimes I want to send different commands to different EDPs. Sometimes I might want to send exactly the same thing to both at the same time. Sometimes I might just want to send commands to one EDP and not the other one. So there's a lot of different ways you could approach trying to deal with that kind of issue. The one that I've arrived at, and that seems to work best for me so far, is to use a MIDI splitter. This is one example of that. This is a MIDI man through 3x8. What this does is has 3 different MIDI inputs, 2 on the front, 1 on the back, and 8 different outputs. Each of the 8 output channels has a physical front panel switch. So that can set it to the A MIDI input, the B MIDI input, or the C MIDI input. And you can set the routing of all 8 of these channels individually and independently of one another. So you could have, for instance, 3 different MIDI controllers going into one of these 3 inputs, and anything on one of the 8 output channels could be receiving any one of those 3 at any given time. For me personally, right now I'm just using 1 MIDI controller and 2 EDPs, so I'm only going to have 1 controller sending information. So if I want an EDP to receive that, I'm going to set it to the input for that MIDI controller. If I don't want an EDP to get that, I'm going to disable it on the front. So we have affixed the MIDI splitter to the top of the first EDP using tape, because we're very high-tech over here. So the foot controller is going into MIDI input C. That's going to be the far right-hand position for each of these switches. So if we have it set all the way to the right, and we press something on the controller, it's going to be sent to both EDPs at the same time. So let me just do a little bit of that. Going into my quick change bank. So this is pretty much the same kind of functionality we were getting as before. Okay, so I'm going to keep the bottom EDP set to our foundation loop. So I'm going to disable the splitter. So that means that the commands sent from the foot pedal are only going to go to the top EDP. That means that I can change content on the top EDP using the foot pedal, but the bottom EDP is not going to receive anything. So if I do a sus replace, it's only being received by the top EDP. Let's reverse that. Up. There we go. Now let's have a bit of fun. I'm going to deliberately break sync by sending a sus insert command to the top EDP. So now our loop lengths are different. I'm going to mess around for a bit. Roll around in the muck, so to speak. And again, the bottom EDP is staying exactly the same because it's not receiving any of these commands. The top EDP is receiving all of these foot pedal commands, and since I'm doing a lot of stuff to change the length of the loop on a kind of granular basis, that loop length on the top EDP is kind of shifting all over the place. Now let's say that we want the loops to be in sync again. What I'm going to do now is re-enable the MIDI signal to both EDPs. I just engaged the bottom EDP receiving channel on the MIDI splitter. So now both EDPs are getting signals from the MIDI splitter. And what I'm going to do now is an unrounded multiply, which is going to line up both EDPs at the same loop length. There we go. Now I'm going to do some replace stuff. Let's do an overdub. Now let's say that we want the top EDP to stay the same and we want the bottom EDP to go nuts. So now I'm disabling the command for the top EDP. So the top EDP is not going to receive MIDI commands, the bottom EDP is. Let's keep the same length and just mess around with it in different ways. So some replace stuff. So I'm going to toggle back and forth between overdub on both of them. And because overdub is a toggle-based function, each time I press the overdub button, that's turning it on for the EDP where overdub is off, and it's turning it off on the EDP where overdub is on. So pressing it, and you can see from the front panel. So this is my fake Jeff Beck stereo Rhodes keyboard effect. Okay, I'm gonna turn this off. So now let's do an unrounded multiply. It's pretty sloppy. There we go. Overdub on both. I like that. Let's reverse. So here again, let's say that we're going to have Echoplex 2 be the foundation loop. So I'm going to turn that off on the splitter so it doesn't receive any commands. So now the top one, EDP number 1, is going to become the one that we mess with. Let's multiply that out. Uh-oh, what happened? I don't know what happened, but I got a very short loop length. So let's work with it. Okay, so now I'm going to re-engage the MIDI splitter so it's sending to both, and let's try and do an unrounded multiply to get everything back in sync. Now let's just send it to one of them. Now let's reverse that. Send it to the other one. I'm doing replace. Reverse it again. The signal flow, not the actual loop. And now let's send the same thing to both of them. Now it's exactly the same signal on both. And here again, let's disable the MIDI signal from 1 so that just one EDP is getting stuff. I like that. And let's send them both into half speed. And I'm gonna add some snare hits on both at the same time. Back up to full speed. right, so let's do this. Let's record the same thing on both of them. I'm holding down sus replace. Gonna overdub a couple of things. So right now, it's exactly the same loop length and exactly the same loop content in both. What I'm gonna do now is disable the MIDI signal to one of them, and I'm going to send a very, very quick sus insert command to just one of them. So this is my fake Steve Reich phasing thing. So it was just a few milliseconds of a sus insert command that I sent, but that's long enough to slightly change the length of the loops, which means that now they're phasing out of sync with each other. So if you've been digging anything that we've been doing with this red box, the question now becomes, do you have to have this exact red box to do what we're doing? And the answer is not really. The reason I got this in the first place was to do a 5 Echoplex series of gigs back in 2005 in New York City at a 5.1 surround sound venue called The Monkey that genius guitarist Dominic Frasco was running. I arrived at this solution because I wanted to use the same foot pedal banks that I was already familiar with, and I wanted to have the flexibility and the freedom to send MIDI to any combination of those 5 EDPs that I wanted to. So in a case like that, this really saved my life because I could very quickly decide, okay, I want to do an unrounded multiply just on EDPs 2 and 3 and not have the other 3 EDPs receiving commands. So it was great. I could think very intuitively. I didn't have to deal with remembering which preset had which combination of things. I was also using a second MIDI controller for those gigs. I had an old drum machine that I was using as a sort of push-button controller. I had different drum pads assigned to different MIDI commands that was going to a separate input. So I could have one group of EDPs receiving commands from the foot pedal and a second group of EDPs receiving commands from the drum machine if I wanted to. For what I was doing in this video right now, you don't really need to have that much flexibility. If you have a MIDI splitter and you can configure 3 different presets, then you can basically do everything that I've been doing in this video. One preset would be sending the same MIDI output to both EDPs at the same time. A second preset would be sending it to just the top EDP. A third preset would be sending it to just the bottom EDP. There may be some subtleties that I'm spacing out on right now, but as far as I can think of, as far as I can tell right now, if you have something that will do that, then you should be able to duplicate the kind of functionality I was doing here. The more EDPs you're sending commands to, or the more different controllers that you want to be able to send commands to, or commands from, the more involved it's going to get. The main disadvantage to a lot of hardware MIDI splitters I've seen is that you have to save the different MIDI arrays as presets. In other words, a lot of them that I've checked on at least don't have a physical control where you can just spontaneously decide. You actually have to program that stuff internally and then go through a lot of menus and button pushes in order to access those different parameters and to change them. I say that admittedly not having been in the market for a hardware MIDI splitter for a long time, because this does what I needed to, and I haven't been looking for a replacement since then. There may be new stuff out there now that I'm not aware of. So a lot of it just comes down to what you need to be able to do, how much flexibility you need to be able to have access to. In any event, this has been a crash course in MIDI control for 2 different EDPs, both sending the same commands at the same time and using a MIDI splitter to send different combinations of commands to both or one or the other at different times. Thank you again very much to Steven Clements for commissioning this one. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye-bye.